When you hear the word Easter, what pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably one thing. But if you strip away all the modern traditions, you're left with one of the most audacious claims in all of history. In this explainer, we're not going to treat it like a nice story. We're treating it like a case file, an impossible claim that absolutely demands to be investigated.
On one hand, you've got the Easter we all know, right? It's pleasant, it's commercial, it's about new beginnings. But on the other hand, you have the original event. And it's stark, it's brutal, and let's be honest, it's completely unbelievable. It's a story that starts with a state execution and ends with a reported resurrection. So how do we get from one to the other?
So let's set aside the myths and traditions for a minute and just look at this as a historical proposition. The core claim is simple. A man named Jesus of Nazareth died, and then he physically came back to life. Now, for a claim that extraordinary, you would expect some pretty extraordinary evidence. So what does the case file actually tell us?
This is it. This is the core assertion, straight from the primary documents. And notice the language. It's not a metaphor, it's not some spiritual idea, it's a direct physical claim. The tomb is empty and the person is alive. This is the central piece of evidence that we have to scrutinize.
Now, what's so fascinating is where this investigation begins, on common ground. We're going to look at 4 key facts that the vast majority of historians, and that includes skeptical and non-Christian scholars, actually agree happened. You see, the real debate isn't if these things happened, but how on earth you explain them. First up in the case file, this is the foundational piece of the entire puzzle.
Okay, fact 1. 3 days after his very public execution and burial, the tomb where Jesus' body was laid was found empty. This is the starting point for everything else that follows.
Now, this quote is incredible because it comes from Jesus's opponents. This was the cover story they told people to spread. But just think about what they're admitting. In order to explain why the tomb was empty, you first have to concede that the tomb was empty, right? I mean, if they had the body, they could have just paraded it through the streets of Jerusalem and ended this whole new movement instantly. But they never did. So the tomb is empty. But that's just the first piece of evidence. The second fact is all about what happened next.
So, after the discovery of the empty tomb, you have tons of different individuals and groups of people reporting that they saw Jesus alive. And crucially, they didn't describe him as some ghost or a vision. They said he was a physical person they could touch and talk with. And the sheer scale of these sightings is critical here. This wasn't just 1 or 2 people having a strange day. The records talk about multiple appearances to all kinds of different groups, including one instance that involved over 500 people at the exact same time. Now, this is from a letter written by the Apostle Paul, and he's quoting a creed that scholars date to within just a few years of the event itself. He is essentially throwing down a gauntlet here. He's saying, you don't believe me? Go ask them. Most of these 500 witnesses are still alive. That is an unbelievably bold, almost reckless challenge to make if it isn't true.
So we have an empty tomb and hundreds of witnesses. And that brings us to the third fact, which is all about the dramatic human transformation that happened next.
Just look at the disciples. When Jesus was arrested, the historical accounts are unanimous. They were terrified. They scattered, they went into hiding. Their leader, Peter, denied he even knew the guy. And yet, just a few weeks later, these same men are boldly preaching in the streets of the very city that just executed their leader. What could possibly account for that kind of radical transformation, from utter fear to complete fearlessness?
And this leads us to our 4th and final undisputed fact. And for many, this one is the most compelling of all. It's about the conversion of the most unlikely people imaginable. First, meet James. This is Jesus' own brother. During Jesus' ministry, the Gospels are pretty clear that his own family thought he was out of his mind. James wasn't a follower, he was a family skeptic. But after the crucifixion, he completely transforms. He becomes a key leader of the church in Jerusalem and is ultimately executed for his new belief. So you have to ask, what could convince a man that his own brother, who he thought was crazy, was actually divine? The early church's answer is simple. James saw him alive. And then there's Saul of Tarsus, who we now know as the Apostle Paul. He wasn't just a skeptic, he was an enemy.
His entire mission in life was to hunt down and completely eradicate the early Christian movement. Then, he claims to have a personal encounter with the risen Jesus, and he does a complete 180-degree turn. He goes from being the church's greatest persecutor to its most influential missionary, and he too was eventually executed for the very faith he once tried to destroy.
So we have an empty tomb, mass eyewitness claims, and the transformation of both followers and skeptics. But that's all coming from inside the movement. What did outsiders have to say? Well, let's look at some of the corroboration from non-Christian sources of the time.
And let's be super clear, these are not Christian writers. The Roman historian Tacitus, who actually despised the movement, he confirms that its founder, Christus, was executed by Pontius Pilate. The Jewish historian Josephus independently confirms the existence of Jesus and his brother James. And Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, reports back to the emperor that these early Christians worshiped Jesus as a god, a belief that is directly tied to the claim that he had conquered death.
Okay, now, any good investigation has to consider alternative theories. So how else could we possibly explain these 4 facts? Let's cross-examine the most common objections.
What about a mass hallucination? Well, modern psychology tells us that hallucinations are private, individual events, not something that's shared by 500 people at once. Okay, well, could the story have just evolved into a legend over time? The timeline is a huge problem for that theory. Like we saw, the core beliefs were recorded within just years of the events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive and could have refuted them. All right, so what if they just made the whole thing up? Then why start preaching this story in Jerusalem? The one city on earth where the authorities could have just produced the body and ended the whole lie on day 1.
Okay, so after looking at the evidence, the next logical question is, so what? Why has this single event mattered so much for 2,000 years? To really understand the significance, we have to rewind from the resurrection back to the crucifixion. The source material explains the core Christian concept of atonement using this really powerful analogy. Imagine a just judge. Her own son commits a very serious crime. She loves him, but justice demands the penalty be paid. She can't just let it slide. So what does she do? She steps down from the bench, takes her son's place, and she pays the penalty herself. Justice is satisfied, and the son is set free. Christians believe this is a picture of exactly what happened on the cross.
And this is exactly why the resurrection is the absolute linchpin of the whole thing. Paul puts it about as bluntly as you can. If the death of Jesus was the payment for sin, then the resurrection was the receipt. It was the proof that the payment was accepted and that death itself was conquered. Without the resurrection, he says, the entire faith is futile. It's pointless.
So at the end of the day, we're left with a really stark choice. Either a small group of terrified fishermen, a skeptical brother, and their former archenemy all conspired to pull off the most elaborate and successful hoax in human history. A lie they were all, by the way, willing to be brutally tortured and killed for. Or the central claim of Easter is precisely what they said it was, a historical event that changed everything. The case file is open, the verdict is yours.